Yeah, thank you. So today we have the true privilege of learning about and engaging in a discussion on interventions that work in reducing firearm-related injuries. Our speakers today are renowned experts in their fields and have dedicated their lives to studying firearm violence and developing prevention strategies that help protect our patients and the communities we serve.
Our session is going to run for about 1.5 hours. Each speaker is going to present for about 10 minutes, and they're going to have a 3-minute Q&A directly after their talk. And at the end of all the speaker presentations, we're planning to host an open Q&A that'll go for about half an hour. And so for all attendees, please feel free to type questions into the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. There's also a feature to upvote certain questions. So if you feel that a question or comment is particularly of interest to you and you really want to hear it get answered, feel free to use the like feature for that. And before we get into our presentations, each of our speaker is just going to give a short 30-second introduction. We also wanted to mention that one of our panelists, Dr. Marie Crandall, is actually currently in Florida, and she's potentially able to join us, but of course, given the hurricane, is a bit delayed. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Catherine Hoops.
Awesome. Thank y'all so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. Do you want me to go ahead and start my part, and I can share my slides and all that?
Yeah, actually, if you don't mind, I'll just ask for like a 10-20-second introduction of who you are, and we'll go.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
No worries.
I'm Catherine Hoops. I'm a pediatric intensivist at Johns Hopkins, and I'm core faculty in the Center for Gun Violence Solutions in the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where I also direct the Center for Clinical Programs and Practice, which is aimed at building a bridge between our gun center in the School of Public Health and the schools of medicine and nursing to translate that evidence into clinical action and advocacy. So I'm really excited to be here with y'all tonight and to talk to you more about some of that work.
Thanks so much, Dr. Hoops. Dr. Miller, do you mind introducing yourself next?
I do not. Hey, I am Matt Miller. I'm the Executive Director of Suicide Prevention for the VA. Clinical psychologist by background, Michigan State University, MPH, University of Michigan. And I served as a clinical psychologist with the United States Air Force during OEF, OIF, and now with the VA. I started as a chief of mental health at a local VA healthcare system level in Michigan, and then became the national director of the Veterans Crisis Line, and now oversee all of suicide prevention. This is a very important topic for us, and one of the most solidly supported interventions, that being lethal means safety, particularly around firearms. So thrilled to be talking about this, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Miller. And now, Dr. Masiakos, can we have you introduce yourself as well?
Sure. I'm Pete Masiakos. I'm a pediatric surgeon in Boston at MGH, where I've been faculty for 20 years. And I'm the director of pediatric trauma in that place, and co-founder and co-director of the Center for Gun Violence Prevention that started in 2018 with my co-director partner, Hannah Sachs, who's a medical internist. And we found that my interest was essentially injury prevention, put myself out of business for the last 15 or 16 years, owing to the fact that I've helped advocate for laws in Massachusetts that have changed injury outcomes. Gun violence was sort of the next step for me about 10 or 15 years ago. And here I am. Thank you for having me. I think this is a wonderful showing that things are happening, despite many people think that nothing is happening, to be doing this on a Thursday evening with you. Thank you.
Great. So now our first speaker today is Dr. Catherine Hoops. I guess we can just go forward with your presentation. So again, Dr. Hoops serves as an attending physician in the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit. She's the director of the Pediatric Critical Care Medicine Vascular Access Service. Her research is focused on a public health approach to the prevention of firearm injury and violence. And she is a core faculty member in the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health's Center for Gun Violence Prevention and Policy. She conducts research on creating effective policy measures, implementing a trauma-informed approach to care, effectively communicating with patients and families about firearm safety, and improving physicians' education on and counseling related to firearm safety. So Dr. Hoops, if you'd like, you can share your presentation screen now and we'll get started.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. All right, can everybody see those okay? All right, super. So that's me. One little thing that I didn't, not a super little thing, but a little thing that I didn't say in my intro, but also is of relevance, and I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A portion. That I enjoy, and you know, kind of always being open to new possibilities, which we were talking about a little bit before the call. I'm also in law school, so in the last couple of years, I have gone back to law school in addition to my my clinical and research time, in hopes of enriching the policy research and advocacy that we do, but also bringing legal tools into the clinical setting, developing medical legal partners to address patients' unmet civil legal needs, and thereby promoting equity and access. So I have nothing to disclose, but I do think it's important for y'all to know where I'm coming from, literally and figuratively. I am from Alabama. I grew up in an entrenched gun culture surrounded by hunting and shooting sports. I'm the daughter of the US Air Force, and I spent much of my free time growing up on this little slice of heaven in rural southeast Alabama, which is the commercial hunting camp that my family owns and operates. So I was taught about guns and gun safety from a young age. But as a medical student, as a PEDS resident, and throughout my career, really, it's been continually reemphasized to me how uncomfortable we as physicians, as clinicians are talking about firearms and gun safety. And so especially as, you know, we see our patients dying of gun injuries, I realized, you know, how much I wanted to help with that mission. So one of the benefits for me going first is that I get to, you know, talk about the problem and talk a little bit of epidemiology. But I know that I'm also preaching to the choir here, so we're going to sail through this pretty fast. So rightfully, this article caught a lot of our attention when it was published in the New England Journal a couple of months ago, right? Because it's shocking to see these numbers presented in this way. So for decades, right, motor vehicle collisions were the leading cause of death in youth, but since 2017, definitely since 2020, firearms have been the leading cause of death in youth ages 1 to 24. And I love this graphic because this is a graphical illustration of the public health approach in action and in inaction. Right, the decline in motor vehicle crash-related deaths is a direct result of the application of the central tenets of injury prevention. Right, everything from licensing, crash avoidance technology, normative social behavior around distracted and impaired driving, you know, trauma systems, standardization, access to EMS, you name it. Right, the whole Haddon matrix approach. And suffice to say that the data exists for all of these same kinds of interventions for firearms. But, you know, these lines are going to continue to diverge until we're willing to say that in the same way, you can't be discharged home from the hospital with your new baby until you show us your car seat. We're also willing to say that you can't leave this gun shop until you provide evidence of a proper safe storage device. And so just to quickly summarize the 2020 data, and I apologize, this graphic doesn't reproduce very well if anybody's watching on their phones, but I love this graphic nonetheless, because each of those dots represents one person who was killed by gun violence in 2020, right? So that's 45,222 dots for 45,222 lives lost. And contrary to what we see in the media, usually highlighting mass shootings and homicide, y'all know suicide is the leading cause of firearm death in the U.S. About 54% of deaths in 2020 were suicides, a third of those among the military population. But we saw the greatest increase in 2020 among American Indian and Alaskan Natives, among whom we saw a 42% increase in firearm suicide. So this percentage of gun deaths due to suicide has typically been closer to around 60% for the last 20 years. But because of the massive increase in homicides last year, or in 2020, suicides were slightly lower as a percentage, not because suicides decreased, they also increased, but because of that surge in homicides. And homicides represented 43% of gun deaths in 2020. They've been closer to around 35% for the last 20 years, but homicides increased by 35% from 2019 to 2020. All those smaller sections at the bottom represent about 4% or about 1,500 gun deaths, which were unintentional injuries, undetermined intent, and legal intervention or officer-involved shootings. But you'll note, of course, that we don't have a good system to capture officer-involved shootings as a distinct subgroup. So many of those are included as homicides. But the best available data from the Washington Post tracking system suggests that number is about 1,000 deaths per year. Mass shootings defined by the Gun Violence Archive is for shootings involving 4 or more people, not including the shooter, account for about 2% of firearm deaths are included among homicides. Right, so the availability and lethality of firearms fuels our country's high suicide and homicide rates. And again, 2020 brought the highest proportion of homicides by firearms in history, up from 68% in 2011 to 79% in 2020. And you cannot talk about firearm deaths without talking about racism. Violence is a health disparity that reflects systemic injustices. And as a result of racism in all of its forms, we see firearm homicide victimization rates that are 20 times, sometimes up to 40 times greater in certain cities among young Black men. Young Black women are also 5 times more likely to die by homicide than white women. And I want to highlight here that firearm homicide among Black women increased by 47% from 2019 to 2020. Homicides are the most common type of gun death among children and teens. 64% of child and teen gun deaths were homicides, 30% were suicides. And indeed, more than half of all Black teens ages 15 to 19 who died in 2020 were killed by gun violence. And I know these are over broad strokes, but just think it's important for us to kind of start on the same note with the EPI. When we look at suicides and who's using firearms in suicide attempts, I know we're going to talk about this a little bit more later, but suicide risk increases in the late teen years and then decreases among Black Americans, but increases for white Americans throughout the life course, especially white males. And an important topic for many of us as pediatric providers, but also just a great opportunity for many of us as clinicians to engage in injury prevention counseling is talking about these unintentional deaths, especially among children and adolescents. So there are about 150 unintentional firearm deaths among youth under 19, half of those among kids under 14. Right, so these are people who couldn't walk into a licensed dealer and buy a gun themselves. They're exposed to these guns in their homes, and not just in their homes, in conjunction with an increase in civilian gun carrying outside of the home, but it's really an opportunity to provide education and prevention through safe storage, which I know we're going to talk about later. And the last topic that I want to touch on is intimate partner violence. And in the before times, I could say that every year about 600 women in the US are killed by their partner using a firearm. But in 2020, FBI data show that over 1,400 women were killed by current or former partners using a firearm. And IPV was called an epidemic within the pandemic, right? Because victims faced unique vulnerabilities as they were forced to quarantine with their abusers without access to safety planning and victim advocacy and other services to which they might have otherwise had access. And an abundance of research shows that firearm access is one of the primary predictors of lethality in abusive relationships. And even when they aren't used fatally, they're wielded to exert coercive control and make threats. Victims of IPV are 5 times more likely to be killed by their partner if there's a gun in the home, and this risk is greatest at the termination of a relationship. And this is a topic that we can come back to, but that's especially important when we think about the gaps in our policies related to IPV, such as domestic violence protection orders, which often don't include an ex parte order, which will dispossess the person of firearms between the petition and the final hearing, which is usually about a week. Also highlighting, that some DVPOs exclude dating partners who represent a broad swath of abusers. So, key takeaways from the 2020 data. 2020 brought the highest number of gun deaths ever recorded in the US. This was largely driven by an increase in gun homicides, which disproportionately affected Black and Brown communities, especially young Black men. Gun violence remains the leading cause of death among youth under age 25. In fact, youth under 30 were 10 times more likely to die by guns than by COVID, but gun deaths are preventable. Hawaii has the lowest rate of gun deaths in the country and some of the strongest gun laws, including a comprehensive licensing strategy and an ERPO law. Contrast that to Mississippi, which has the highest rate of gun deaths and some of the weakest gun laws, including permitless carrying and stand your ground laws. So now I would love to talk about our role as clinicians engaging in injury prevention. And I really hope that this will be very discussion oriented. But I did want to just start with one quick thing that I think everybody knows, but just to highlight here. Right after can we even talk about guns as clinicians? After the Florida Privacy of Firearm Owners Act of 2011 was overturned in 2016 as a violation of our First Amendment rights to free speech, no state or federal statute exists that restricts our ability to counsel on firearms. But just because we can doesn't mean we do it particularly well. And firearm owners usually don't rate us as being very effective messengers on firearms. Nonetheless, they trust us, they forgive us for our shortcomings, and over 60% of gun owners are receptive to talking to us. According to some recent when you're talking about access to firearms in the context of mental health issues. So definitely still an opportunity for us to engage and talk to our patients about safety. So, and this is a wordy slide, but one that I hope can just open up the opportunity for some discussion, right? What's our roles in violence and injury prevention? And we have a lot of roles in injury prevention, right? Because there are many opportunities for us to intervene as clinicians in our clinical practice. And I say this often hinges on education, right? Educating ourselves, learning more about implementing a trauma-informed approach, implicit bias and anti-racism in medicine work. Educating our learners and each other through curriculum development and modeling of these counseling behaviors that we're talking about. Educating our patients by implementing evidence-based counseling strategies, providing resources and referrals and creating systems that provide better care for our patients, and educating our policymakers, right, by conducting advocacy for evidence-based and equity-focused policies. And I'll say that this framework is a place from which I can talk about a lot of current projects that I'm doing, that my colleagues are doing, or just other opportunities for clinicians to engage. Right, one of the couple of projects that I can highlight now that are ongoing or are kind of in an implementation phase include curriculum development. I think that about 20% of clinicians say that they've ever received any kind of education on firearm injury prevention. Y'all's organization has done tremendous work in that space to try and bring more education on firearm injury prevention into the med ed space, but we have a long way to go. And all clinicians care for firearm injured patients at some point in their care, right? So standardizing curricula, implementing and studying those curricula is something I think is a real opportunity and is a real focus for me, for our center, and some of the consensus-driven curriculum development work that we've done in the past. We hope can provide a framework for other institutions. A lot of what I hear, people asking for is, structured language and guidance on how to talk to families, right? Especially since you consider that most clinicians, most physicians are not gun owners, right? So we lack technical familiarity with firearms, how to apply safety devices, how to talk to patients and their families about these issues, right? So developing, standard frameworks that can help help clinicians, to talk to patients about firearm injury, I think is another real opportunity, and something that we've worked on in a simulation and in a clinical setting, and had a lot of success with implementing kind of a screening, brief intervention, referral to treatment model targeted towards firearm injury prevention. And I also think that creating advocacy curricula and focused education on advocacy and advocacy training is really important for learners at all levels, and something that we hope to integrate a lot more into our center and our future educational missions. But maybe I'll pause there and see if there are questions, and I'm happy to kind of take any opportunity to jump off and talk about other issues of interest to the group.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Hoops. This has been incredible. We're going to start a few minutes of Q&A right now. So those who are attending, you can navigate over to the question and answer key and just type in whatever questions you may have. Now, to get started, Dr. Hoops, you've got an interesting background with public health, law, and medicine. So how does your work and education at this intersection best enable you to address firearm safety? Would you say that it gives you a unique advantage?
Well, I think that my background in public health and research has still always had a focus on clinician engagement in this kind of counseling. And right, I think that when some of my early work focused on, why are we not talking about firearms as pediatric providers if all of us recognize this as an important part, as a responsibility of ours as clinicians? And what came out in those surveys that I did then were that people just felt like they didn't have adequate training or education. And so I never really thought of myself as an educator. But when it was clear that was where a lot of the need was for pediatricians, that's where we went. And so developing curricula and educational programming, educational modules, counseling frameworks. When it was clear that was a particular need that clinicians had in order to feel competent and confident engaging in firearm injury prevention, right? That's where we went. And so do I think that I look forward to being able to integrate my legal education into some of that teaching and practice that we do in a lot of different ways. But mostly, with my legal training, hope to integrate a medical legal partnership model, right, where we're addressing patients' unmet civil legal needs in a clinical setting when we identify legal barriers to optimal health. Housing policy or housing issues, food insecurity, income, benefits, these kind of issues really that have legal remedies that we can help patients address and then have access to better health and health outcomes. Does that answer your question, Andrew?
It does. Thank you very much, Dr. Hoops. I guess as a follow-up question, for medical students today, what skills do you think would best equip them to address gun safety and talking about firearms with patients? Would it be practical training with firearms? Is this something that you would recommend?
I think that that's helpful for some. I think that practical skills training, with firearms, I think it's helpful for some, but not necessary for all. I think that what is necessary, you have to have some technical familiarity with what you're talking about, right? It's hard to counsel a family on how to select the right car seat if you don't know anything about car seats. And so it's hard to counsel a family on what's the appropriate safe storage device to choose if you don't know anything about the firearms that they own or their rationale for owning them, right? So if you're telling a patient who has handguns for personal protection, to store their firearms in a key locked safe in the separate safe from ammunition and everything in their basement, right? That's not going to be congruent with their motivation, with their rationale for firearm ownership, and then they're not going to be able to implement that, and that makes sense for them. So in as much as I think it's helpful for clinicians to I think clinicians need to have practical training on firearms, not necessarily hands-on skills, not necessarily range skills to do those things, but I do think you need to know the devices, know what kind of the range of options are, so that you can better understand the barriers that your patients might face in safely storing their firearms, for example. Also, if you understand better, why your patients own firearms, you can also better understand, barriers to removing them from the home or, storing them outside of the home, right? I think you need some familiarity, but it doesn't necessarily need to come in the form of range skills. But as far as what do I think is the thing that that everyone needs, I think more education on understanding the scope of the problem. I think understanding and being able to implement a trauma-informed approach, I think is crucial. And I think just really engaging families and having a mutually respectful conversation about exposure to violence, about access to firearms. I think that's what's most essential. If that answers your question also. And I see a couple of questions in the chat. Katrina, I'm not sure if my response before about the decision to pursue a JD, if that answers your question, but yeah, I think in a quick summary, I decided to go back to law school because I wanted to have concrete, rigorous training in policy and policy writing, and in legal frameworks that could help us to address this problem at a policy level. But at kind of a more kind of foundational level, I just see a lot of unmet legal needs in our patient population, and so being able to integrate legal expertise and legal professionals with a clinical team to try and address some of those needs, I think has been shown to be very beneficial in pediatric populations. But there's a couple of centers that are also integrating it very effectively into their hospital-based violence prevention programs, and I would like to see us do that at our institution as well.
That's phenomenal. Thank you so much, Dr. Hoops. Really appreciated this. And I see we've still got some questions left in the chat, but hopefully we'll be able to revisit them at the end in the open Q&A. Just wanted to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Mary Crandall. Dr. Crandall is a professor of surgery at the University of Florida College of Medicine in Jacksonville. She's the division chief of acute care surgery, associate chair for research in the department, program director for the general surgery residency. Dr. Crandall performs emergency general and trauma surgery, staffs the SICU, and is a passionate teacher and mentor. Dr. Crandall has authored more than 225 peer-reviewed research articles and is nationally recognized for her work in the area of injury risk factors and outcomes, disparities, and geographic information systems in trauma research and gun violence. I also just wanted to mention a kudos to Dr. Crandall for joining us while Florida is kind of undergoing this hurricane situation. So really, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and for being here with us today. I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really excited to be on a panel with some people whose work I know and respect, and so excited to be able to talk to really an interested and engaged audience like yourselves. This is wonderful. I have been doing this a long time, and I am in general more of a pessimist, and the last 10 years have made me even more pessimistic about our ability to solve this problem. When I started giving lectures on gun violence, 10, 20 years ago as a faculty member, there were 250 million guns in America. Now there are 400 million guns in America, more than every person in the United States. And it seems that every mass shooting is sparking people to go and purchase more firearms. We're American. We solve our problems and our conflicts using force and violence, and in particular firearms. And it's hard to disengage from that. I think, what is our natural instinct as Americans, and because we are Americans and we grow up in this culture, for those of us who did, if somebody is breaking into your house, your instinct is to say, well, I'm not going to let someone break in my house, I'll just shoot them, right? That is, if somebody tries to use force against me, I'll shoot them, despite all of the best available evidence suggesting that if you have a firearm in your house, you're 8 times more likely to use it on yourself or for someone in your family to use it on themselves or you than you are to use that in self-defense. But that is why so many of us buy. I mean, there's hunting and there's sports, but truly the reason why 1,500 firearms were stolen from open vehicles in Jacksonville alone last year is because people carry small handguns around for quote unquote personal protection, and they get diverted and they get used in crimes, and they are used by a 15-year-old who just broke up with their girlfriend and is depressed. And this is for those of us who take care of who clinically take care of patients who have been injured by firearms. This is what we see every day. We have 15% penetrating of 4,500 patients. When I was in Chicago, we had 45% penetrating. When I was at Martin Luther King as a medical student in the early 90s, it was 60% penetrating. I mean, people shoot each other. We're Americans. That's what we do. The number of guns have gone up, and we're not getting better about it. That being said, this is an important forum, and I went into research because I liked saving people, like saving lives, but I really felt like, somebody gets shot in the chest and shot in the heart, you open their chest and you evacuate the hematoma, you stitch the heart, and high fives all around, the patient goes home in a couple of days, it's fantastic. And then they come and shot again. So when I did my fellowship at the University of Washington, my goal was to learn the skills to do research and advocacy so that I could impact the greater systems. And I would say that I have had some success with that, but clearly I have not solved the problem of gun violence. So another reason to do research is because all of us like to be right. We like to win arguments. And one of the real benefits of doing research is that you know the literature better than anybody else, and that when people say ridiculous things like I keep a gun around the house to save my family because someone will break in and I will use it to defend us, I will use it to defend my family, you can say, well, let me show you the data. And they may not believe you and they may not care, but at least you will have the right answer. So without further ado, I'm going to share what I like to think of as sort of the top 10 list of articles that you can use as references that I think are really some of the best gun violence prevention articles that you can use for discussions and education with your peers, with your family, with your friends, and with your patients. So in terms of disclaimers, and by the way, can everyone see my slides and are they advancing okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. This year I served on the CDC for the Firearm Funding 22 study section, but I have no current funding to study firearms or firearm injury, but I do have opinions. As Dr. Hoops very nicely shared, there are 40,000 plus firearm related deaths per year in the United States, and over 100,000 firearm injuries are brought to medical attention every year, and more than 1,200 children die every year. Since 1968, there have been more civilian firearm deaths than all the deaths from every war the United States has ever fought. And I won't spend too much time on this because Dr. Hoops did a very nice job showing this, but suicide and firearms. If you're a gun owner and if you're a gun owner, your likelihood of dying is higher. If you're not a gun owner, you're not going to commit suicide, but the combination of lethality of means and accessibility with a very user-friendly instrument is deadly. In homicide and firearms, in a multivariate analysis that is actually one of the best, I think, that was published in Social Science and Medicine, actually controlled for things like rates of aggravated assault, robbery, unemployment, urbanization, alcohol consumption even, and resource deprivation, i.e. poverty, and gender and age groups demonstrated a linear association between the percentage of the population living in households with firearms and homicide. So simply, many of the risk factors coexist: living in poverty, urbanization, deprivation indices, but even controlling for those things, the simple fact of having a firearm in the home makes you more likely to die. And as Dr. Hoops mentioned, this is one of the major areas of disparities and health disparities by race, because homicide rates for young Black males are more than 10 times that of young white males, the same thing for women, and non-fatal gunshot wound victims are overwhelmingly Black and Latino and over 90% male. So what are some of the best articles in gun violence prevention? I think that if you know one thing, you need to know that having a firearm in the home makes you less safe. And probably the best work in this was done by Art Kellerman and his colleagues. He's currently now at the Uniformed Services University. But when he was doing this work, it was it was almost shocking at the time when it was published in the 90s, because they used dialing, which some of you may not even remember dial-up phones, but they did random dialing and did a case control methodology of calling people and doing a case matched control with two controls of people who had had suicides in the home. And when they controlled for things like having taken prescribed psychotropic medication, i.e. depression, being arrested, abusing drugs or alcohol, not graduating from high school, gender, when they controlled for all of those things, simply having the presence of a gun, one or more guns in the home, was found to be associated with an increased risk of suicide of 5-fold. So in the confidence interval was 2.7 to 8.5. So even controlling for the cofactors that make it likely to consider suicide, the accessibility and lethality of means and combination with impulsivity increase the likelihood of suicide. Because if you want to kill yourself, but you have to figure out if you have a rafter, and you have to figure out if you have rope and all of those things, it just takes a while, and probably there is some inhibition and you're out of the mood. So the fact that you have a loaded, unlocked firearm in the house makes completion suicide much easier. In terms of homicide, Kellerman also published this study because people keep firearms in the home for self-protection, but does that really work? And so looking at individuals who were killed, they did the same methodology of a case control method where they called people in the same zip code in the same area of residence, and found that controlling for things like illicit substance use or history of prior arrests or having history of domestic violence, even with controlling for all of those things, having a firearm in the house increased your likelihood of being killed or being a victim of homicide threefold. And virtually all of those were in domestic violence related situations. So if you have a firearm in the house, you are much more likely for that to be used against you or have one of your loved ones use it than you are to be able to use it in self-defense. So what about things like permit to purchase handgun laws or loosening restrictions? And in Connecticut, after the Sandy Hook massacre, Connecticut enacted some very strong anti-gun legislation. And Missouri, on the other hand, did exactly the opposite and loosened their firearm registration, purchase, and licensing restrictions and laws. And what they found was that, and this was an ecological study that used a natural experiment, 2 states that had relatively similar laws and then diverged. And what they found was that there was a 15% reduction in firearm suicide rates associated with Connecticut's more stringent laws, and Missouri's law repeal, its more restrictive law repeals, was associated with a 16% increase in firearm suicide rates. So there was a 30% delta between the 2 states. And that indicates that simply having the, again, impulsivity and lethality of means makes suicide much more possible and easier to complete. So what about other things? So right to carry laws and lessons for empirical evaluation of law and policy. I really like this paper. It was a white paper that came out in 2014 but I like it so much because it had so many covariates. It used aggregate data from multiple sources using national, county, and state data and covariates that were, in absence of being able to randomize households to having a firearm or not, this was one of the best retrospective multivariable analyses that I've ever seen. And they looked at everything in terms of population risk estimates, including incarceration rates, homicide rate fluctuations, the crack cocaine epidemic trends, and others. And they found a 3% increase in homicide rates and up to a 38% increase in rape and aggravated assault rates in states with concealed carry laws. And I thought that was really, really interesting. So people are not defending themselves against potential perpetrators. Instead, these concealed carry firearms are being used in aggression. And that's a problem, but it fits in with the idea that simply having a firearm makes you less safe. There was another study that was published in the American Journal of Public Health about 7 or 8 years ago that looked at concealed carry weapon owners in Texas, compared with case match controls of the same race and ethnicity, and mostly men. And what they found was that the concealed carry weapon holders were, over a 10-year period, were less likely to have been arrested for minor offenses, things like drug offenses, minor drug offenses or traffic violations, but they were as many as 2 to 3 times more likely to have been arrested for intimate partner violence and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. So again, the idea of having a firearm does not make you or your family safer. April Zioli has done a lot of work in this area, and of course Daniel Webster is very well known in the firearm injury prevention world in terms of research. Really has a website. Like some of the, if you want one resource place to go, Webster's Firearm Injury Research Consortium is just fantastic. But looking at the effects of domestic violence policies, alcohol taxes, and police staffing levels on intimate partner homicide. Oops, I'm so sorry. Let me go back. I did not mean to do that. And what they found is that reducing access to firearms for domestic violence restraining order defendants and increased police staffing levels and allowing the warrantless arrest of domestic violence restraining order violators seems to reduce the city level risk of intimate partner homicide. In particular, states that have more stringent laws regarding domestic violence perpetrators and firearm access have decreased rates of firearm related intimate partner homicide. Fewer people die if you restrict access to firearms. And what's interesting is that the mandatory arrest law has been looked at, and in some states like Minnesota, it actually decreased the likelihood of intimate partner homicide. In other places like Los Angeles, where it was studied, it did not. And in fact, there was an increase in domestic violence related homicides after the person who was briefly incarcerated was let go. So I think it's less about police staffing and more about the availability of firearms. And for any of us who take care of victims of intimate partner violence and intimate partner domestic violence, we need to screen not only for domestic violence, but also for firearms in the home. I really like this study. This is one of the earliest studies that looked at accessibility of firearms and underscores the fact that simply having firearms makes you more likely to die. And this was done in Colombia right around the time of the that it was 92. So it was around the time that the crack cocaine epidemic and the Medellin cartel and they were just ballooning, and there was so much violence. And the folks from the University of Washington partnered with folks in Bogota to look at the effects of a ban on carrying firearms and homicide rates in two Colombian cities, in Bogota and Cali, which were both devastated by firearm violence in the 90s. And what they were able to get, they were able to enact temporary legislation that if you were wandering around the streets after midnight, the police could stop you. If you had a firearm, they would confiscate it and send you on your way. They wouldn't keep it. You could go to the local police station and you wouldn't be arrested. You wouldn't be given a ticket. You could go pick up your firearm the next morning. But it was from that 12 a.m. to early morning hours that these were confiscated in these two cities. And what they found was an immediate stepwise 20% reduction in firearm related homicides in both cities. And when they stopped that type of policing, frisking, confiscation, it immediately rebounded back to baseline. So it is the fact that you're carrying a firearm and you're probably out drinking or carousing with your buddies, and you get into some sort of altercation or you get mad at somebody and you use that firearm. Simply having the easy availability of that lethal means increase people dying, and taking it away decrease the likelihood that people would die. So they actually put it to the voters. And of course, as would be expected, everyone felt very unsafe without their firearms. So it is not what happened in Colombia. They had to deal with the rebounding of their firearm related homicides. And I think it's important to recognize that the rest of the world thinks we are crazy. They think we Americans are crazy, and we are. I have given lectures in other countries, and I know some of you have on the panel as well. And whenever I talk about my experience as a trauma surgeon and all the people that get shot, they just look at me in bafflement. Like, how do we let this happen? In theory, we're a fairly advanced country in many ways, but we let people shoot each other, and we let toddlers shoot and kill their parents. It's insane. So after Australia's 1996 gun law reforms, there have been multiple studies of this, because of course it was an ecologic experiment that they did some gun buybacks, they confiscated firearms, and they made it much harder to purchase firearms. What they found was a fairly dramatic drop in particular firearm related suicides, but also firearm related homicides. And it's continued. They have not had one mass shooting since the Port Arthur massacre in '96. Then what about children? Because sometimes we can rally people around children. It worked in Connecticut. It hasn't worked in other places, certainly didn't work in Florida after the Parkland massacre or the Orlando massacre, but nonetheless, it can. And does that work? So the folks folks in Miami looked at the effect of gun control laws on hospital admissions for children in the United States. And what they found was that states with more stringent firearm laws were less like, had lower per capita rates of firearm related homicides, firearm related suicides, and unintentional firearm related injuries. And this just underscores the fact that easy access, more guns, gets you more firearm injuries. And then the association between youth-focused firearm laws. So there are some folks that say, well, I think, you know, if adults want to kill each other, they should be allowed to, but what about kids? And it seems that youth-focused firearm laws do decrease, not in a huge way, but child access protection laws are associated with about a 10% reduction in firearm-related suicides in ages 18 to 20 and overall suicide rates. So even though people aren't shooting themselves, they're also not finding a substitution method. And it just, again, underscores that intersection between impulsivity, which is particularly pronounced among young people and teenagers, and the lethality of means. So gun storage practices and risk of youth suicide and unintentional firearm injuries. The Dave Grossman and his group at University of Washington led a group at University of Washington and other centers that interviewed respondents with firearms and did a case control study very similar to the Kellerman work that demonstrated that keeping a gun locked, unloaded, and storing ammunition separately are associated with a protective effect and are something that we should counsel our patients, particularly if you take care of families with children and firearms in the home, because easy accessibility, impulsivity, lethality of means someone's going to get shot and killed. So firearm safety tips, keep your firearm pointed in a safe direction, keep it unloaded when not actually in use. Always assume a gun is loaded. Store your firearms in a locked cabinet, safe, gun vault, or storage case inaccessible for children. And using a gun locking device, they actually have some biometric ones similar to the way you open your iPhone with a finger or like a fingerprint identifier. And that actually is a good thing. But of course, the argument for any of these is that I am defending myself and my property, and I can't, if I store them safely, then I don't have access to it when somebody is breaking into my house. But again, statistically, that is not how firearms are used. So when we're counseling families, we should do this, but I don't actually have a good answer to what to tell people with that very American perspective. And in fact, one of the projects we're doing at the American College of Surgeons Committee on Trauma level is a qualitative study of trauma surgeons who are firearm owners who store, in looking at having conversations with the people who store their firearms unsafely, because these are trauma surgeons. They know what these do. They have kids in the home, and yet they still store or don't store. They leave their weapons loaded and unlocked lying around. So it's kind of a mystery to some of us who think that's, insane. That's just a one bullet away from family tragedy. And so the discussions have been really, really interesting. I'm not the one doing the group, just, to decrease bias. I'm not the one leading those discussions, but we've had so many interesting conversations with trauma surgeon firearm owners who know the data, and they endorse that they know the data, and yet they still behave in ways that are antithetical to safety. So with that, I hope I imparted a little bit of my dismal worldview to you, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Dr. Crandall. Really appreciate your perspective. Yeah, I think if anyone has any questions, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A box, just as you all did prior. We've got about 3 minutes. And just to kick us off, Dr. Kendall, you spoke a lot about different like research topics, and you have like a really in-depth research knowledge. And, thinking from the perspective of like a medical student, I'm curious to hear what you see are maybe some gaps, current gaps in the research in this field, and also some future directions in research around firearm violence prevention.
I think we have to go into that space of the disconnect between the reason that people are buying more firearms is because they're feeling unsafe. We know that from studies in psychology. So, and we're not making that better. So we need to find out why there is that disconnect. And so this study that we're doing with the COT firearm owners is actually, I hope, to be illuminating, because these are folks who are engaged in the conversation, who have read the literature, so they're knowledgeable about it. And I think what we learn from that, we need to extrapolate to our communities. There will be a percentage of families that will, just like there will be a percentage of families who wouldn't have otherwise used car seats, but will now use car seats. There will be a percentage of people that you say, kids shoot themselves when you leave your firearms loaded and unlocked. Can we hook you up with a biometric lock or give you a coupon or something like that? But I don't think we're making any headway at all in the psychology of why people are buying firearms. And a lot of that has to do with so many layers of feeling safe and being American and patriotism and racism and racial strife, socioeconomic strife, deprivation, anger. It's all a powder keg. That, I think, is where, if we can get to the root of that, we might begin to make a difference. Because, dead kindergartners did not seem to make a difference.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Dr. Kendall. So actually, it turns out that Dr. Miller had to drop off the panel at the just right now. So he apologizes for that, and he's more than happy to share his slides with all participants. He was presenting on his work with the Veterans Affairs and on suicide prevention efforts as he kind of leads that at a national scale. And so, yeah, just again, thanks so much, Dr. Kendall. We're going to move on to our final speaker of the evening, Dr. Pete Masiacos. Dr. Masiacos is the Director of Pediatric Trauma Services at Massachusetts General Hospital and the co-director of the MGH Center for Gun Violence Prevention. He trained at Boston City Hospital and Hospital for Sick Children. He developed a clinical interest in pediatric trauma care and injury prevention. He is currently the director of the Pediatric Trauma Surgery Service at MGH and has become a vocal injury prevention advocate and educator. And I will hand it over to Dr. Masiacos.
Thank you so much for having me tonight. And the great thing about being last is I can go and edit my slides as the talk scope and eliminate about 2/3 of them, because the speakers that preceded me did a great job at framing this, right? The thing about gun violence and any other injury prevention strategy, as a member of the COT for the last 10 years, you try to understand why surgeons and trauma surgeons try to put themselves out of business. And the clear answer to that is because prevention is far better than anything we do in the operating room. As though Marie talked about patching a hole in the heart and giving high fives, the idea of legislative advocacy and saving lives by the dozens because of some interesting injury prevention strategy is far more pleasing for me as I've evolved from a young resident to a old boomer surgeon who's the oldest in my practice now. So I think things have changed over the last few years about looking at strategies of impacting violence, impacting car seat use, and how do we get to that place? I wish I had an answer for you tonight. I wish I could say the same thing about guns as I could about car seats and seat belts and all of the other things that we talk about with respect to injury prevention. But I will say this, those industries eventually came to the table. And we're having a hard time attracting the industry that needs to come to the table to impact this problem from the standpoint of prevention. So I hope that will change. I'm going to share my slides and go through what we have done in Boston to try to address the issues that both Dr. Hoops and Dr. Crandall have mentioned in trying to establish a trauma-informed care plan to deal with both educating our residents, to deal with the patients that they see every day and become lifelong patients of theirs, and also the community that's impacted the most from this problem. So let me go back to the beginning of my slide deck. Sorry about that. I have nothing to disclose either. As I said, I started the program at Mass General about 5 years ago. And the intent was really to study the problem, define the issues, and address education as best we can with what we know. My partner, Dr. Sachs, wrote a perspectives piece in the New England Journal of Medicine right after the Uvalde and the Tulsa shootings and the Buffalo shootings, which sensationalized America, were sensationalized in the media. And really what we hear about from our media and from our public is these tragedies that happen over and over again, and the school shootings that people witness now almost monthly, and going back to that December day where children were killed in their classrooms in Sandy Hook, Connecticut, which mobilized a bunch of very well-intentioned folks to try to impact this problem. But you know, after that, Dr. Crandall said that if it doesn't change after children are killed in their classroom, how will it change? And you know, I'd like to say that things have changed in the last 20 years and 10 years because we're sitting here on a Thursday night talking about this issue with the people that are going to actually impact it. I do believe this in the future is really thrilling to me. But the key of this slide here is not necessarily the names in the black dot in the middle, but the other 2,348 names that sort of circulate around this black dot that happen to be deaths from the 19 days that followed those shootings. And none of those stories are told, right? Very few of them are told, I should say. Some of them are the sensational child finds a gun in the nightstand and shoots their cousin, may appear on a byline, but the reality is we are focused on things that happen infrequently, and that's something that we decided we would try to address. What is our role as healthcare providers? Dr. Hoops and Dr. Crandall both touched on this. And really, it is to educate ourselves and educate the public about what we know and the risk factors that are associated with that, with guns. And to define that problem, which is something that we should all think about doing before we advocate for anything, whether it's an ATV law at the state level or something going to the federal government and trying to advocate for a change in Consumer Product Safety Commission issuances. But we have to be schooled in it. We have to know it. We have to know what it's about. It's sort of the same conversation that we have with anything we learn, whether it's sexually transmitted illnesses or the topics that are very sensitive and difficult to discuss with your patients, but somehow we've overcome those things. For me in the 80s and 90s, as I was training, it was HIV and AIDS. It was the dilemma that we all face in trying to talk to our patients about something that was not only a death sentence at the time, but also stigmatizing. And trying to get around that cultural difficulty was hard for us, and we overcame it. Drunk driving also, with respect to our teens and how we discuss this in the home and how that has modified behavior and risk. And then identifying those risk and protective factors, which we've clearly identified tonight. The problem of gun death, which is the overwhelmingly discussed word, is access to lethal means, the propensity for guns to be around, impulse and anger, and other concerns that we really don't know. I'll point out that all of the talks tonight focused on homicide and suicide and the resultant deaths, but Dr. Crandall mentioned a little bit about those patients that come to us and last forever with spinal cord injuries or some kind of disability that causes them to become our lifelong patients. And those injuries are not very well understood. We see them as trauma surgeons, but the CDC wiped the website of injuries because nobody really knows what actually is going on out there. The standard deviation or the confidence interval was so great that it was meaningless. And these are some things that we would like to get our head around as we study the problem a little deeper. And what we've done is we actually have looked to see whether or not we are actually asking the questions in the hospitals and whether or not we see patients, documentable patients who have injuries related to firearms and firearm access. So we did a little natural language processing work that's ongoing now. The paper is being written. And we looked at all of our data over a 10-year period, and we pulled 80,000 charts and looked at all of the natural language processing for the words for firearms and anything that you can think of related to guns, and compared those to alcohol and tobacco. The alcohol bars are black, the tobacco bars are orange, the gun bars are blue. And as you can see, across all of the specialties, there is very little documentation about access to lethal means, firearm injuries, and really in surgery and other specialties which are exposed to this, we're not even doing it. The psychiatrists do a little bit better, but it's about 8% of the time. So from that, we went on to look at specific risk factors that portend danger that you should actually ask the question, is there a gun in the home? And actually a pediatric resident started this study with us back in 2017. And in 1 year, she looked at all of the patients who came into our emergency room, pediatric patients who came into our emergency departments with either suicidal or homicidal ideation. And trainees at MGH at that time asked about access to lethal means 5% of the time. The psychiatrists did a little bit better and asked about 69% of the time, but a quarter of the patients who came in with suicidal or homicidal ideation were discharged home without even asking or documenting the question of gun access, which we thought was pathetic, to say the least. So we had a lot of learning to do. And how did we do it? We went to a simulation model. And in 2018, I asked the program directors of all of the residency programs at MGH to sign on to the possibility of having the surgical residents, the medical residents, the pediatrics residents, OBGYN, psychiatry, and medicine spend at least 2 hours during their boot camp talking about gun access, gun laws, gun risk factors, and also understanding how to discuss these sensitive topics with their patients. We brought together stakeholders from every residency program in a 2-hour thought-provoking, very interesting session of how do we formulate scenarios regarding patients with respect to what their specialty is seeing. And you can imagine psychiatry residents and surgical residents being in the same room, where the psychiatry residents needed an hour to talk to their patients about access to lethal means in a mental health crisis, and the surgical residents wanted to do it in 5 minutes during a right upper quadrant examination of the gallbladder. But we came away with remarkable scenarios, and including one example, which Dr. Hoops talked about with respect to a second trimester pregnancy coming to an OBGYN clinic who is a victim of interpersonal violence or intimate partner violence. And the idea of asking the questions divided into two situations, one in which the patient was receptive and one in which the patient was not. And of course, pizza was offered. It really inspired people to think and actually produce some really cool things. And we started the program in 2019, and every single resident that comes through MGH now in their intern year gets a simulation session where we go over a didactic, which was constructed by experts around Boston with respect to the things that you heard tonight, tapping into Art's papers and Dan's papers and getting the best that we can as far as what we know with respect to access to lethal means and protective mechanisms that you can avoid. We also have taught to give out swag because people who go to their physicians and receive something are more likely to learn the thing that they were just talked about if they take it away, and the physicians feel better and empowered if they give away a gun lock or something else that's affirmative. And we've surveyed all of the residents that have come through the program before and after, and everybody has said that this is a great thing. And everybody is thinking about doing it in the clinic, but are they doing it in the clinic? So we went back again and looked at those patients that are high risk. And in the ensuing year from 2018 to 2019, only after one session with the residents, the number of documented access to lethal means in the chart of suicidal or homicidal kids went up to 32%. Good, better, but still a little bit of work to do. So how do we scale this? So the program is a simulation-based program where we have hired standardized patient actors who play the role of the patients, just like you would have in your OSCE examinations. And the patient actors are amazing. We've been using the same service for the last 4 years, and some of them come in camo, some of them have done it many, many times. And what we see in the learning of this is that not only are the students, the residents taking away something from the session in understanding what needs to be done in the clinic, but the standardized patients are learning. There was an example last week, we were doing a sim session in surgery, and the surgical residents were talking to the patient who was a demented patient with right upper quadrant pain about access to lethal means in the home. And the surgical resident offered the opportunity to file a red flag or ERPO filing to the patient's provider or a daughter. In Massachusetts, the ERPO law, which was the 14th in the country, doesn't allow physicians to report. And in the way that it was presented to the standardized patient actually stopped the session and informed the resident that in Massachusetts, the ERPO law is not reportable by the physician. So we're seeing learning even at the level of the standardized patients, which are remarkable. So getting it out of MGH, we've trained now close to 600 residents at MGH. We've done it across Boston at nurse practitioner schools and psychology classrooms. We've gone to Harvard Medical School and done a small pilot with them. But getting it to other places is a little bit difficult, especially since other places are not Boston and not necessarily have the same experiences as Boston. So we've teamed up with a group in Cincinnati at Cincinnati Children's Hospital that have been doing simulation and VR-based learning. Joe Riel and Matt Zakoff have been looking at vaccine hesitancy using VR and environmental platforms. And we've gotten a grant to build the avatars for gun violence discussions. And we are about to embark on a side-by-side comparison between our sim session with standardized patients and the same curriculum using avatars and computer learning. All of this is going to be binary and responsive, and we're gonna record it. The outcomes will be compared, and we'll see how it goes. And then hopefully we can scale this and go out and talk about this in a bunch of places where standardized patients are not affordable, which they are very expensive, $125 an hour for those who are interested. But then beyond that, I want to get back to this idea of what's the best way to be dealing with this informed trauma, informed consent. And why is Boston maybe not the place, or maybe it is. Maybe it is the place where it's exemplified to try to get our heads around what else is going on in the community. I went to a talk about 3 years ago, just before COVID hit. And it was a talk that was taking place at a local public radio station stage. And it was an amazing panel of leaders in government, the Speaker of the House, the Governor, the Attorney General, several School of Public Health authorities, and the person who wrote the article that if we were as good as Boston, if every state had the same laws as Boston, there would be 27,000 fewer deaths in America. And a woman stood up from the back of the room and said, "This is not my Boston." And one by one introduced students from her neighborhood, which was Roxbury, to talk about their Boston, where they dodged bullets for a living. And you could imagine these were kids of color. And I stood there and watched nobody able to pivot on the stage. Nobody could talk about what is happening in their Boston, where we see only 40 deaths a year in Boston and 450 injuries per year. What would the narrative be if we center the voices of those who are most affected? And as a result of that moment, Hannah and I walked over to Emerson College, which is a film school and media school and entertainment school in Boston, and talked to their engagement labs director about possibly starting a collaboration between Mass General and Emerson College, where we can actually center the voices of the community by bringing them into the classroom. And we did our first session of classes in 2021. We did 3 classes. One was a media class, one was a theater class, and one was a gaming class. And they produced some content. And the dynamics of the class were wonderful. There were parent survivors and students and teens from the neighborhoods that I talked about who came into the classroom and became teachers. And we learned so much from that we actually brought it back to our trauma-informed care and are now teaching our residents based on the videos that have been made. I'll show you one video. This is the promo video of the class, and it'll give you a little bit of context of what we're doing with Emerson.
That's not our Boston.
That's not our Boston.
Esto no es mi Boston.
Este não é meu Boston.
That's not my Boston. C'est pas Boston pour moi. That's not my Boston.
Children don't deserve to be killed. They don't deserve to be shot down.
For every person shot by a firearm, at least 10 immediate family members are impacted. Repeated gun violence and the systems that perpetuate it lead to trauma for individuals, families, and entire communities.
Child dies in the emergency room from a gun wound and nothing happens.
Coming into the hospital and somebody making a cold remark like, which one are you here for? Because there were multiple people who were shot that night.
To make that John Doe or unknown male a person, right?
How is it that journalists are covering these stories and are choosing these sensationalist headlines instead of in-depth reporting? How is it that policymakers are making decisions about how to allocate funding without really understanding the voices and the stories of the communities whose policies are affected directly by this?
We are a community
of storytellers.
Lifting up the voices
of those most impacted by
gun violence in our city.
Every day in Boston, neighbors are coming together to support one another.
For individuals like me, who were formerly incarcerated, we do commit to the uphill journey of building a new life and paving new pathways for those who will come after.
Transforming narratives of gun violence is a collaboration between the Engagement Lab at Emerson College, the Center for Gun Violence Prevention at Mass General Hospital, and the Louis D. Brown Peace Institute. Through co-created documentary, interactive and immersive media, games, journalism, theater, and more, we are inspiring solutions and interrupting cycles of violence by focusing on what people have, not what they lack.
Social Impact Studios are semester-long experiences at Emerson where students and faculty work alongside community members to understand the roots and impacts of gun violence narratives in the media so that they can create new ones.
The initiative is guided by a collaborative leadership team, including members of community organizations, doctors, elected officials, faculty, and students. The leadership team guides, amplifies, and distributes the narratives we make together.
To healing, to peace, to sustainability. What are we transforming to a better community?
So, trying to advance the slide here. Sorry.
You might need to use one of your arrow keys.
Yeah, I'm trying to do that actually. I'm gonna escape and I'm gonna escape again. And so again, I think this is the best Tuesday of my week. I go to the classroom every Tuesday that the kids are doing these interesting documentaries, and we're going to do a screening of the documentary that was produced last year to the federal court judges this next Thursday who are interested in doing some restorative justice work with us. And what I want to say is that we've focused on raising the voices of the people that have really been impacted by this, that are often left out of the conversation. One of the other things that I touched on is the burden of trauma is not equally distributed, but it's not equally understood either. We asked the Boston Police Department, and actually Baltimore, New York, and a few other cities have given us information about the 911 calls that come in from certain parts of the city, and we can co-locate them and geomap them now. And in Boston, we have about 2,000 shots fired 911 calls every day, every year. And as you might imagine, they happen at night. And we've gotten together with some sleep scientists to look at how this disrupted sleep from the shots and the sirens and the lights might affect the children and the adults that are living in those neighborhoods. We're surveying and looking at school absenteeism and the violent trends that happen with the known lack of sleep that our collaborators have been looking at for a while. So the ripple effects reverberate around the city and are not only limited to death. And this is an important thing that I'd like all of you to take away with. Those coincidental injuries and the non-fatal and the injurious injuries that might impact the community. And without including them in this conversation, we can't have informed care. That's what I've been doing, and there certainly is more work to be done. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you tonight and have my esteemed colleagues to join us in saying we're doing what we can do, but we're counting on you to help us out. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Masiakos, and thanks for sharing that video with us. That was very powerful. I'm just looking at the clock right now, and I think just to conserve time, we'll go into our closing for this program. But if our panelists are willing to stick around for maybe an extra 5 or 10 minutes, I'm happy to leave this webinar open and just give some time to answer questions or respond to the questions that are already in the chat box, if that's okay with y'all, but also absolutely no pressure to stay on longer. So yeah, with that, just wanted to say thank you so much to all of our presenters for sharing your insights today and for all of the impactful work that you all are doing in your respective fields. Also wanted to thank all of our attendees for taking time out of your busy schedules on this wonderful Thursday evening to join Stand Safe 2022. And on our screen, you should see there's a little QR code that has like a safe PayPal donation page. If you'd like to support the organization, donations are all tax deductible.
Hey, it's Marie Crandall. I just wanted to thank you all again for organizing this and for your interest in the topic. you guys, the next generation of anti-racist, community-focused providers that will lead the charge, you know, and I think that that's so critical. Dr. Masiakis mentioned the importance of recognizing disparities, Dr. Hoops, and I also touched on these firearm fatalities, firearm injuries do not, they are not evenly distributed among the population. But remember, I mean, there's racism and racial violence in other countries, and they still don't have the kind of firearm related deaths and suicides and homicides that we have. So the vector is extremely important, and the easy access to such a lethal means, 400 million guns in the United States. We need to be cognizant of that. Every day we need to be anti-racist and advocates for restorative justice and community empowerment and things like community-based violence prevention programs and supporting that, and wraparound programs and transition to society. All of those things are really critical. We've actually had, due to some partnerships with the city, some tremendous successes in an otherwise red city and a red state here in Jacksonville. But ultimately, like I said, 1,500 firearms were stolen from cars in Jacksonville last year, and they were diverted to be used for suicides and homicides and unintentional injuries. And every day I have a 13-year-old or a 15-year-old come in with a traumatic brain injury because of fill in the blank, girlfriend, boyfriend broke up with them. It's another part of our hearts and souls that are destroyed. So remember, it is all those things, but it really is the vector. And in pretending that it isn't is really being the ostrich.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Crandall. Now, we encourage everyone to visit our website, standsafe.org, join our email list, and follow us on Twitter. So everyone's going to receive a recording of this conference to your emails, as well as those who couldn't make it. Anyone who registered will receive an email with the recording, as well as slides from Dr. Miller's presentation that he couldn't stick around for. Now, for our chapter members at medical schools across the country, again, thank you so much for attending. Every Stand Safe event is designed to motivate and enhance your experience as medical students. We focus on providing resources and programming to help empower you in promoting firearm safety in your own communities. So please reach out. Let us know how we can help you, be it helping connect you with gun violence prevention teams for research, or providing materials to organize firearm safety initiatives at your institution. We're here for you, and we can be reached at info@standsafe.org. We'll have the panelists stick around for a few minutes to answer a few questions. I do see a couple left in the question and answer post. So we've got a few for Dr. Crandall, as well as a couple for Dr. Masiakos. So I'll hand it over to you.
Oh, Dr. Crandall, I think you might be on mute.
Crap. Sorry, rookie move. I see one about the gender disparity in firearm-related injuries and homicide. There's absolutely true. There's a huge gender and age differential, and how can we use this to develop better strategies? I mean, there is a reason that we send young people off to war, right? Because middle-aged people like myself are not going to sign up for the military because we understand mortality. Firearms violence and interpersonal violence is not completely sequestered among the youth, as we know, but it is absolutely true that they are a harder to reach population. It's harder to change behaviors, and it's harder to engage. I think the most successful programs have been things like community engagement, changing structural violence within communities. But for those of us who are on the front lines, I think the community-based violence prevention programs like Cure Violence Models with credible messengers have had the best success rates. And there are good systematic reviews and meta-analyses of the data that show that in places that have somebody who is a community member, knows the people, who says, okay, I know you're having a beef with this person. How can somebody not get shot today? And will, potentially broker treaties or pay somebody for something that got stolen or pay somebody for product just so that someone doesn't get shot. That decreases the level of acceptability of violence, using violence to solve conflict in those communities. And in places that have stable cure violence models with community credible messengers, that seems to decrease it seems to help. Because people still have guns and they still have violence and they're still distressed communities, but at least in those areas, there are fewer people affected. And like Dr. Masiakas mentioned, the ripple effect is decreased and diminished. And there have been psychological studies that demonstrate that community members themselves find that less acceptable. So I think that finding young-ish, slightly older, for 25 to 45-year-old people that are still engaged in the community, that can be those messengers and are trained in crisis management, are trained in conflict mediation, is really critical. We need to pay attention to that, but also transition back to society for folks who've been incarcerated, decreasing the effects of mass incarceration on our distressed communities, in drug and alcohol services, mental health services, all of those things.
I'm going to add something to that. I think it's very important. It's a very important thing to consider the credible messenger in this whole discussion. It's very important. And the VIAP or the HAVI programs that have existed to try to establish reduce recidivism have been very impactful. And in fact, where I trained at Boston City Hospital, Thea James has been a pioneer of it. And some surgeons as well, Rochelle Dicker is doing an amazing job at HAVI. But that's after the bullet hits the person, right? And so what we have to put our heads in is the idea of preventing the bullet from hitting the person. And where does that happen? Where does the thought of picking up a gun start? And we're finding from our community that it's happening in the 12, 13-year-old range, where kids start to think about sex and other things that 13-year-olds think about. And trying to identify a place where you can impact and educate is where we're trying to establish our foothold in Massachusetts and in Boston proper, where I think that should be a discussion going forward from all of the intervention aspects of gun violence. So yes, we've done amazing work in stemming a little bit of recidivism with HAVI, but I think we have to start thinking upstream. And if anybody else has something to say about that, I'd like to hear it too.
I'll just chime in as a pediatrician also, right, that we have to be thinking about these things earlier and earlier in our counseling. I think there's also, well, I'll go to HAVI first, that in the next few months, they'll be coming out with some consensus guidelines on program development and kind of key programming for hospital-based violence prevention programs that I think will be really impactful, but also recognizing that there are some gaps in that data, and some of that data is dated. So there's a lot of work still to do on hospital-based programs, even while we're doing kind of the things that we know work. But I would absolutely echo, right, that this counseling has to start early and it has to be community engaged. I think, my city is doing a lot of work with community policing too, right? So also working on repairing those relationships between disproportionately policed youth and the police in their communities, trying to repair those relationships, working on community mediation and alternative conflict resolution strategies. I think all of those things are really important, and also have to start really young to have an impact on our communities.
We are taking our curriculum into the schools actually in Boston. We've just signed a contract with Boston Public Schools, and we're going to be doing school nurses first. In having those conversations, we have psychologists that are involved with the school nursing programs, and hopefully getting to the third grade and conflict resolution and the idea of impactful upstream mitigation. So I think this is all great.
And there's actually there was an interesting, what the principal at Fenger High School, which had that very widely publicized death, and and they had something like 120 arrests every year of students. They hired a new principal who enacted things like peace circles and embedded conflict mediators in the school, and they went from 100 arrests to 0 in a year, but it cost $1 million. And so Chicago Public Schools decided not to fund that again, and they went back to 100 arrests. I think because, again, we're Americans and the psychology of violence is throwing police at it, that we are more comfortable with dealing with the aftermath of violence than spending money to try to prevent it. But it's clearly what is important. And with respect to, but you know, if people were just wrestling it out, people don't often get killed, but with the easy access to firearms, people get killed all the time. And it's a real challenge. One of the folks in the chat said many of your articles favor gun laws that appear to be unconstitutional in the US in 2022. And that's absolutely right. You are right. And our Supreme Court, as you know, is going in a way, some of us, and I'm just going to show my colors, is going in the wrong direction. So where do you go? Where do you go with that? You do what Dr. Hoops has done. You do what I do, which is advocacy and voting and encouraging your family, your friends, everyone to vote and to protest against things that are unconstitutional, that you think should be unconstitutional and are unsafe for your communities and your patients and your family and your friends. So, you know, yeah, the tide is going in the wrong direction right now, but it's our country and we vote, and it is our responsibility to do something about that.
I'll put on my law student hat for a moment just to say that even in the Bruen opinion, there's hope, right? You know, they don't say that every aspect of gun regulation is now, you know, incongruent with the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, right? There is room for gun safety legislation. There is room for regulation, and so you know, don't lose hope, but also don't stay on your couch, right? So, you know, continue to get out there and be advocates, evidence-based advocates, because I think there's a lot of ways to get this data into the hands of the judiciary. And I think that matters. And I think over time that will be compelling. And I think there is room for that, even with the new test for firearms regulation at the Supreme Court level.
And that's the bipartisan act that just passed in July, signed in June. I attended the signing, and that's something that was done that, you know, even in this environment of going in the wrong direction, things happened. And you know, Steve Dettelbach was confirmed as the ATF director for the first time since 2008. So that happened. And the American Pediatric Surgical Association was very vocal about that. And, you know, I like to push buttons, and, you know, I have the luxury of standing in a place where I can do that. And I think that what I will bring this back to is the conversation of having a conversation. The Mothers Against Drunk Driving changed culture. I can attest to the fact that I didn't pay attention to what I was doing when I was driving at 17, whether I was wearing a seatbelt or maybe having a drink when I shouldn't have had and gotten into a car and drove. That's not happening very much anymore. It happens, but it's not happening like it did. And that happened to be a cultural change. You don't get into a car and not strap yourself in. You don't put a kid in a car and not secure them. I'm exaggerating because we do see these things. But when I trained, we used to see, and Marie's going to attest to it, we used to see duodenal injuries from seatbelts all the time. I haven't seen one in the last 10 years, right? And the reason for that is because kids are being secured by their parents. This was a discussion in the pediatrician's office. This is exactly what we have to do here.
Kids in Boston are being strapped in appropriately.
Well, even across the United States, in pediatrics, yes.
You are definitely, Boston is better than the rest of us, just like Canada is
Yes.
better than the rest of us.
Yes. Yeah. But we are better as a whole.
Yeah, I actually have had 2 duodenal and pancreatic injuries this year in pediatric patients.
Yeah, what did you have in your training?
It wasn't that common because people didn't wear seatbelts at all. They just flew out the window
They died,
unrestrained.
yeah,
They
yeah.
died. When I say that with humor, we are in a better space with respect to child restraint. No, without question. It's so much better than it was. Florida is not particularly observant, but other places are better.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Dr. Reeves.
Can I chime in on the ERPO
Yeah, of course.
question and the clinician petition? As a resident of a state with a clinician petition, and someone who has seen the barriers to clinician petition, I don't know that I agree that that's the best pathway forward. Do I think it should be an option for us? Maybe, but right, we have seen, I mean, in the whole first 2 years of clinician petition for ERPO implementation in the state of Maryland, despite tons of education and attempts to raise awareness, we saw fewer than 5 clinician petitions. And so way less than 1% of our ERPO petitions in Maryland since we adopted clinician petitions several years ago have been by clinicians. So there's just so many barriers to clinician petition, and the popular support for ERPO is so much stronger for a family member petition that I still think, even in states where clinicians can't petition, you can still help to facilitate, a law enforcement petition or a family member to petition. But there's a lot of barriers to clinician petition that have kind of unintended consequences. Like you have to clear your schedule for an entire day to go to that hearing, and then you have to do it again a week later. So there's a lot of potential barriers that I hope that will, and we're actually doing a study right now to look at the development of a role that we're calling a gun violence navigator in our institution to help to facilitate appropriate petitions. But without intensive resources within communities, for example, in health departments, et cetera, I think it's really challenging. But I do think that clinicians need to be aware of ERPO as an instrument and be aware of the pathways in their state. Because you can definitely still alert law enforcement about a patient who is at imminent risk to themselves or someone else, and ask law enforcement or a family member to petition and then help them through that process. And then especially the family petition really has a tremendous amount of popular support and usually is very effective. So I was just going to chime in there.
Yeah, thank you for that. I really appreciate that. And I see that there may be one or two other questions in the chat, but I think our speakers have put their emails in case folks would like to reach out to them directly and ask them any questions. Once again, just wanted to really thank you so much for your time, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Crandall, Dr. Hoops, and Dr. Masiacos. So yeah, really appreciated all of you being here, and of course to all of our attendees. So yeah, with that, I'm gonna take